The Edmonton Oilers almost certainly can't afford to upgrade their goaltending room. But if they could, here's what they should go after on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I just wrapped up my third NHL season as a host on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And on today's show, we are going to have yet another conversation about the state of the Edmonton Oilers goaltending room. I am going to lay out some candidates for you that I think would be worth upside gambles. So before we get there, our opening segment, I'm going to lay out the case for the umpteenth time as to why the Oilers need to upgrade their goalie room. We'll talk a little bit about the types of goalies you're going to find available at this point in the summer. In our second segment, we will talk specifically about some of the candidates. And then in our final segment, we will talk about the reality of the situation and why, in spite of it being a glaring need, I am doubtful the Oilers will add to this room at least before the trade deadline next year. So to start things out, and we talked about this a ton over the last few weeks, especially as we watch the salary cap gymnastics begin. And I think we are going to see teams more reticent than ever to let players move on. I think teams having more money in the system is going to push a lot of these groups more towards that mushy middle, because average or outright bad teams, they're going to have more cap flexibility than ever to maintain where they're at, to keep players they think will have value. And I think the most textbook example I would point to in this regard is look at what Nashville did last year. They had a binary choice to make: Saros or Askarov. Askarov, the highly touted amateur goal, I shouldn't say amateur, prospect goalie, had a great track record at AHL Milwaukee. And the Predators could have started to orient their team around whatever the next orientation of the team was going to be, likely around Askarov and any wave of younger guys. Instead, Nashville looked around and said, we know Jussi Saros is pretty darn good. We think that even if we take a step back, we are going to be good enough throughout the duration of Saros' contract that we can justify doing this. We are going to trade Askarov so that he gets ice time with another team that he desperately wants. And on top of that, we're going to get some assets back to be more competitive right now. And generally speaking, I think we will see this problem continue to creep up. And I made this point on Locked On NHL Game Night yesterday. And the big thing for me, and the big talking point for me, there are not enough good goalies to go around in the NHL. There are not 20 good starters, let alone 64 good goalies, so every team can have a quality starter and a backup. And we know that when teams find an amateur goalie they like, it takes a while for them to break through. And a lot of the guys we're going to talk about in our middle segment, they are going to be unable to get serious opportunities. I think you look at some of the more optimized handoffs. The one that most directly comes to mind is what Tampa Bay did with Ben Bishop going to Andrei Vasilevsky. That's the most direct example. Saros taking the reins from Pekka Rinne. Igor Shesterkin from Henrik Lundqvist. There was a little bit of an Alexander Georgiev interlude in there in the middle. But we know goalies take a while. We know that goalies, especially when we're talking about at that lower level, when you're in a junior hockey or a college hockey season where you're playing 40, 50 regular season games, making that leap up to the 82 game calendar, that's a real physical impediment. And one of the goalies we're going to talk about in our next segment, Devon Levi, is someone who struggled with that, going from the college world where you're only going to play 30 games in a whole season. And of course, not going to start every game, even as a starting goalie with a 35, 40 game season, including playoffs. But with that in mind, I do think it's important to understand that a lot of the goalies we are going to talk about in our next segment are not the most proven of candidates. These are not guys with big track records because teams that have decent goalies are not going to move on from them, even if they aren't going to be a particularly competitive team. There is always going to be an incentive, even if you're an average team, to have a decent goalie to give yourself a puncher's chance. And I'm not saying an average, a Cam Talbot type goalie isn't going to make a difference on a team like, say, the Sharks or the Blackhawks. But I do think there is something to be said for the fact that we see teams like Detroit are constantly churning through goalies, constantly trying to find someone they feel is better than the last guy they had. And that's one way to look at it. And then there's what the Oilers are doing, which is the gratitude perspective, the idea that, well, we don't feel great about Skinner or Pickard, but we know what these guys are, and we can plan on this. We can bank on this enough in the regular season. Pickard, I think, had the second most wins of any backup in the NHL last year. When you can bank that and say your goalie just doesn't have to sink you in the majority of their starts in the regular season, it's very easy to justify what ultimately might be your undoing. And look, I'll be brief. I don't think Skinner and Pickard are the reason the Oilers didn't win in the Stanley Cup final either of the last 2 years. I think if the Oilers had a Shesterkin, a Sorokin, a Vasilevsky, a Hellebuck, someone in that caliber, that tier, maybe you make an argument they steal a game that the Oilers lose. But I don't think Pickard or Skinner were the determining factor in either series. Unquestionable that the Oilers could have gotten more from their goalie room, but their lack of goal scoring, their power play struggles in particular this past season definitely stand out as far as bigger culprits in their ultimate demise. But before we take our first break of today's show and start talking about some of the candidates, I think that would be at least exciting. It's important to think in terms of a GM and in terms of managing the room. And we know a lot of guys on this team, they will ride for Stuart Skinner, even if we are frustrated, even if we feel like at times he leaves a lot to be desired at the position. The Oilers have put a lot of time and effort into Stuart Skinner. I know there's been some conjecture as far as the Oilers replacing their goalie coach. I think that's definitely something that is worth consideration, something that would be worth doing if management and the coach and the players and the two goalies, whoever they should be, think that's something that might be able to garner better performances, by all means. But ultimately, it's going to come down to the guys who are in net. And I think Pickard, for as clutch as he's been in spots coming in the playoffs the last 2 years, I think there's a reason he was in the AHL and he was in Europe before he became Skinner's backup a couple seasons ago. And then in the case of Skinner, I think he was a victim of his own success in the sense that he probably wasn't ready to be an NHL starter 3 years ago, the first time he took the net. And of course, he won the 41 games, made the All-Star team. The Oilers went to the conference finals. They felt like they had found something there. I don't think Skinner at his age 3 years ago was ready for that level of responsibility, that type of role. And the Oilers, reticent of moving on, not wanting to rock the boat and not wanting to introduce more volatility to their roster, felt they could plan around what Skinner would give them, which was just enough. That 898, 900 window, it's not great. It's only about 0.005 better than league average. But when the Oilers are as good as they've been in the regular season over the last 2 years, that's enough to get by. And of course, the goal shouldn't be to get by, but we are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll talk about some of the mystery bachelors who could solve the Oilers goalie problem that I would love, in all honesty. Coming up next. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf on the green, or high-stakes soccer, FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburnt at the beach. FanDuel is the best way to stay in the action. FanDuel makes it so easy before the game starts or well after things are underway with live betting. And with things like same game parlays and live betting, it makes you feel like the game is never over. And if you're new to FanDuel, there's never been a better time to sign up because new customers can bet just $5, get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Believe me, one more time, hit your first $5 bet and you will get $150 in bonus bets if that first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit fanduel.com to get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are wishcasting other goalies onto the Edmonton Oilers. And look, I want to be fair to Stuart Skinner and Calvin Pickard. I know what they are. Asking guys to do things outside of their means is a reflection on the team. I hate to use Facebook fortune cookie wisdom here, but we'd all be very disappointed if we asked a fish to climb a tree, if we asked a monkey to go swimming. Certain types of animals can only do certain types of things, and certain athletes only are good at certain things. I think if Stuart Skinner were in a more conventional 1A, 1B tandem, similar to maybe what we saw from Joseph Woll and Anthony Stolarz, Kochetkov and Freddie Anderson, back in the day, Jake Allen and Brian Elliott, if we saw something more similar to that, I think there's a world where you could get by with Stuart Skinner. He'd be a little bit better because he wouldn't have to play as much. I think there is an argument to be made that you get more efficient play if you were able to use him a little more sparingly. And this past season, I think Pickard played probably a little bit more than the Oilers had hoped he would in the regular season, just because Skinner had been so volatile. There was that one really rough stretch in the early part of the season where it felt like the Oilers just couldn't get anything going. Eventually, the temperature of these games started to die down. The team's defense started to stabilize. They figured out their rotation of their top four. They got by with just enough defense. So with that said, I do want to talk about some actual goalies who, at least on the surface, based on the team they're on, their contract situation, could make sense. So you've heard me mention a few of these guys before. We'll start in Buffalo with Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and Devon Levi. I bring both of them up for two reasons. Number one, they signed Alex Lyon last week, and a lot of Oiler fans had thought, well, Lyon would at least be better than Pickard. He's somebody who's a few seasons removed from a decent NHL season, 910, 911 save percentage, which isn't insane by any measure. That's not Vezina caliber goaltending, but it's a good 10, 15% better than what the Oilers got the last year and a half, 2 years. So if you could maybe play Lyon and Skinner in a tandem, you'd feel a little bit better about that. And like we said before, if you play Skinner a little bit less, you might be able to coax slightly better performances out of him. But at the same time, Buffalo also has Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and Devon Levi. Now, Devon Levi is not currently under contract. He's a restricted free agent whose rights could conceivably be available. The question, if you're the Buffalo Sabres, then becomes, do we want to re-rack here? And I know Sabre fans are kind of at their wits' end when it comes to restricted free agents and the Sabres trading away their rights or trading away players due for a payday, because they have seen so many players go on to greener pastures, perform better, ultimately win championships. St. Louis, Ryan O'Reilly comes to mind, of course, down in Florida, Brendan Montour, Sam Reinhart, and of course, Jack Eichel out in Vegas. So there is a real frustration simmering there amongst that fan base. And I think Devon Levi, for all of his amateur accolades, a really good college hockey player at Northeastern, somebody who was a bit of a late bloomer, former 7th round pick, not somebody who was on the radar of a lot of teams in his draft year, somebody who was real developmental, really slow along the process. And with no contract, there's a world where the Sabres could talk themselves into doing effectively their version of the Askarov trade. Now, UC Saros is making a lot more money than Pekka Luukkonen is. Pekka Luukkonen's coming in at 4.7, 4.8 million per year. That's a workable number. And I know the Oilers would need to move money out to make this work. They're only 800,000 clear of the cap right now. And I know that's not a lot of money to work with. And we know they asked Darnell Nurse about potentially waiving his no move, Adam Henrique as well. Both those players ultimately told the Oilers no. Victor Arvidsson and Evander Kane were willing to be traded. That's why they were both moved out. Now, if the Sabres wanted to go with Pekka Luukkonen and Lyon and try and turn Devon Levi into something that they could build with, I don't know if the Oilers are a great fit there. I think the Sabres would very much be inclined towards right now ads. They would want a piece to play right away as opposed to draft picks, because the Sabres desperately need to break through where they're at. And the other side of that coin, let's say it was Pekka Luukkonen instead of Levi, well, that would be the Sabres trying to cut salary, $4.8 million. And the Sabres are relatively clear. They have a lot of money, if I remember correctly, when I looked at Puckpedia. Yeah, the Sabres are projected to have $13 million in cap space for this upcoming season. They're paying Pekka Luukkonen $4.7 million. Alex Lyon's under contract for $1.5 million. And then Devon Levi is a restricted free agent. So the Oilers could potentially acquire his rights. But with that in mind, I think the Sabres are at a position now where their fan base wants a pound of flesh. Their fan base wants some blood in the street for the mess of the last few years. And I think there would be a lot of reticence to move on from Devon Levi, who had a really good year in the AHL, somebody who 2 years ago I thought was going to be able to become at least a tandem goalie with Pekka Luukkonen. Ultimately, Pekka Luukkonen played well. Levi got hurt. Pekka Luukkonen got a majority of the starts. The only reason I mention Buffalo in this conversation is because they signed Alex Lyon. Now, I don't think Devon Levi is going to spend the entirety of next year in the AHL, but I do think if Alex Lyon were put on waivers, he would get claimed. I do think there's a team out there, whether it's a bad one like San Jose that wants somebody to kind of be a little bit more of a rock behind Askarov, or if it's a team like Edmonton that's a little bit desperate for an extra goalie. Next up, after that, we can pivot to talking a little bit more about Montreal. Montreal is another team I've mentioned quite a bit when it comes to goaltending because they have two goalies in Sam Montembeault and Jacob Dobyshev, and they signed Kaapo Kähkönen last week as a part of their free agency mix as well. Now, Dobyshev got forced in injury spots last year, a couple games in the regular season and in the playoffs when Montembeault got hurt. Montembeault is somebody who has lingered around the periphery of Team Canada in their goalie conversation, somebody who's never been great by any means, but has enough high-end traits that people feel like it might translate to something a little bit better on a better team. I'd be curious, and the conversation's very much the same. Montembeault is not making a lot of money, under $4 million per year. If Montreal were inclined, they could clear that money. And I know Montreal's in a weird cap situation because of the Carey Price money that needs to be LTIR'd. But if Montreal wanted to clear the path to Dobyshev, or if they wanted to turn Dobyshev into assets, they could potentially do that. Now, why would they do that when they're in the position they're in? I don't think they would. But this is a restricted free agent goalie in a year who has potential and upside, and the Oilers need to raise the ceiling of their goalie room. That's the question to me. How do you raise the ceiling of this group? And then, real quick, the last one. I think this is a long shot because I think Carolina has him in line to be the long-term successor to Freddie Anderson, who continues to be the Carolina starter in the postseason. But Pyotr Kochetkov is a goalie I would be circling if I were Edmonton. Should you find the right bundle of assets to convince Eric Tolsky that he's the guy? I suppose you could do the inversion of this if you wanted to try and turn Stuart, Skinner, and assets into Freddie Anderson and have Freddie Anderson be your starter for a year or two. But that's not a long-term solution. Freddie Anderson's 35. He's got serious injury concerns, somebody who has been a relatively injured player throughout his NHL career dating back to his time in Toronto, but he is undoubtedly better than what both Pickard or Skinner would give the Oilers. I, for one, am living in the land of delusion. I want the Oilers desperately to add to this goalie room. There are goalies out there. We just rattled off a handful that are at least logic-based, could work. They have upside. They have cost certainty in the case of Pekka Luukkonen and Montembeault. Not crazy cost certainty in terms of just the raw cap hit, but when Pekka Luukkonen's under 5 and Montembeault is under 4, that's enough there that you could make it work. That's enough there that the Oilers would only need to move one or two pieces to create the cap space to improve their goalie room. And you improve the goalie room, you might be able to get by with one less quality forward or one less quality defenseman. But we are going to take our second and final break on today's show. When we come back, I'm just going to kind of pound the desk as to why this needs to be addressed and why the Oilers cannot afford to do this for a third straight season. Coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we once again break down this goalie situation, which, as long as the Oilers refuse to address, lingers as the elephant in the room. And sure, could we have this conversation about the forward group? Yeah, that's why we spent 30 minutes talking about Jeff Skinner yesterday. Could they stand to add to this defensive group? Yeah, I think there's an argument Troy Stetcher, Ty Emberson, probably a little on the weak side to be a sixth defenseman on the Stanley Cup caliber team. But I think in relation to the goalie room, which is so just out of place on a Stanley Cup contender. You've seen it for 2 straight years now. Not be the deciding reason the Oilers couldn't break through, but being one of the contributing factors. And when you think about it in terms of where the Oilers go from here, I think there's an uncomfortable conversation to be had about next summer when Stuart Skinner is going to be a free agent, what that next contract looks like. And we have to compare that against the backdrop of whatever a Connor McDavid extension is going to be. We are going to have to talk about that in terms of how do they replace Adam Henrique's spot in the lineup? How do they go about starting to plan for life after Mattias Ekholm? Should he move on or should he take a more reduced role? And really quickly, you start to see how this snowballs on you. And that's kind of the point of the salary cap. Teams are trying to stave off the aging curve, staying where they are, and getting better all at the same time. And walking that tightrope becomes the challenge for contenders to manage breaking through. And sometimes, unfortunately, that does take a step back. You think about the Bruins won a Stanley Cup back in 2011. They had to miss the playoffs once in there to reorganize their group. Ultimately, of course, the Bruins didn't subsequently break through, didn't win a second Stanley Cup with the Bergeron-Chara group, but after missing the playoffs that one year, the year they had the 3 first-round picks, they were able to reorganize their team. You drafted Charlie McAvoy, you bring in a Torrey Krug, you find David Pastrnak, you get Brad Marchand to another level of his game based on the team you bring around him. You find a way to stay cost-effective through in-house additions, in-house development guys like a Matt Grzelcyk or a Brandon Carlo. You think about this in terms of St. Louis, who had to go through some ugly patches there in the mid-2010s where it seemed like they might never break through before they ultimately did. Missing the playoffs is never ideal. When you are a team that is as talent-laden as Edmonton is, especially at the top of the lineup, it puts you in a difficult position to justify wasting a year. And I know this becomes a bit of a zero-sum game when we're talking about a team only in the perspective of, are they good enough to win the Stanley Cup? If not, they should be rebuilding. I don't think it's realistic to think like that. I don't think professional sports franchises can operate like that because of the stakeholders at hand, whether that's ownership, corporate sponsors, season ticket holders. You can't tell the Edmonton Oilers fan base, yeah, guys, we're probably going to have to miss the playoffs for a year of McDavid, Draisaitl, and Bouchard because we just don't have the cap space to figure this out. No. As much as I would like that to be a realistic possibility in terms of getting to the ultimate goal of winning a championship, I think if you asked Oiler fans if they'd be okay with missing the playoffs once, if it meant they would win a Stanley Cup in the next 5 years, I think unequivocally you would get yeses across the board. But because that's not a certainty, because that's only a possibility, teams are a lot more reticent to take that tactical step back, to retool, if you will. And I don't think the Oilers are going to be in a position to do that. I don't think you can sell Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, and to a lesser extent Evan Bouchard, on the idea that, yeah, guys, we need to take a step back because we need to find a franchise goalie, and without one, it's going to be really difficult to put something together. And I don't know what the answer is here. I've suggested a handful of trade candidates. Freddie Anderson, excuse me. John Gibson got traded leading up to the draft, so that was never a realistic possibility. The Oilers also couldn't have made that money work without getting rid of another player on top of the ones they did get rid of in Henrique and Arvidsson. I suppose they could have found, not Henrique, excuse me, Evander Kane and Victor Arvidsson. I suppose the Oilers could have tried to make something else work there money-wise. Maybe Skinner goes the other way, and that's at least $2.6 million of the 6-something John Gibson was making. But with all of that said, as much as I want to keep banging the drum all summer long until the Oilers find a way to upgrade their goalie room, unfortunately, it feels like they're going to stand pat. And I feel that's extremely unpalatable. I honestly, and I know this isn't a direct one-to-one, but if the Oilers are going to run back the same goalie room for a third straight season just because it's the most cost-effective thing to do you really think the rest of the team that has lost all of the talent it has over the last 2 years, when you talk about the team from 2 years ago, you lose Holloway, Broberg, McLeod, Warren Fogle. This past year, you lose Connor Brown, you lose Corey Perry, you lose Arvidsson, you lose Evander Kane, you lose Jeff Skinner. You lose all of that talent in a 2-year window, and you're running back the same goalie room, and you have more question marks than ever in your forward group. It really begs the question of how good can they be? And with that said, you don't want to get cynical. You don't want to get doomerist. But it is hard for me to sit here on July 7th, recording for July 8th of 2025, that the Oilers are going to be able to offset the volatility of their goalie room with the skaters that are in front of them right now. I don't feel this forward group right now is where it needs to be. And of course, they will be in the market to add at the deadline. The Oilers, as a Stanley Cup contender, would be fools not to add. They will need to accrue cap space as the season goes along to be able to add anyone of note or bury some guys in the AHL. But with that said, I do think the Oilers are stuck, and some of it predates Stan Bowman. You know, if you've got a mulligan, you're not giving Darnell Nurse that contract after the 2021 season. If you got a mulligan, you're not signing Jack Campbell in free agency, and you wouldn't be paying that buyout, and you would have a little more flexibility. But at the same time, they made shrewd moves like trading for Matthias Ekholm, signing Zach Hyman, getting Ryan Nugent-Hopkins on that long-term deal that they did to put them in a position where they could afford to kind of cheap out on goaltending a little bit. And look, ultimately, the Oilers are going to be relatively solid here. Their forward group definitely has more question marks than each of the last 2 seasons. Their defense, though, coming into the season is the best it's been in a few years. Having Jake Wallman at your disposal in the top 4 definitely definitely enables your ability to feel a bit more confident. The fact that Brett Kulak played as much as he did last year and as well as he did in the regular season in increased role should be a bit of a cause for optimism. But all of that is to say, running back this goalie room for a third straight season feels a bit self-defeating. And I say that as someone who likes the Skinner-Pickard tandem as dudes. You know, I empathize with Stuart Skinner that he's being asked to do a whole lot relative to his abilities. I understand that him and Pickard are probably a bit underqualified for what the Oilers have asked of them, and they're doing their best. And unfortunately, it's hard for me to be mad at guys when they're doing their best because that's really all you can ask of them. But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, like the video. Let me know, is there a goalie you're thinking of that I didn't mention on today's show you would be interested in? By all means, let me know down in the comments. I will talk to you guys tomorrow, but before we go, be sure to check out Locked On NHL and the 2025-2026 NHL season previews that are going to begin on the Locked On NHL Game Night feeds, which are both going to be found on the Locked On NHL feeds. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.